Hello and welcome to another interview by Just in Time Worlds. My name is Marie Mullaney and with me today is Drake. Drake, please introduce yourself.
So I am Maxwell Alexander Drake. I do go by Drake. Let me see. I'm an award-winning novelist. I was the lead fiction writer for a massive game from Sony called EverQuest Next. I've written comic books and graphic novels and screenplays and musicals and TV and movie scripts. And I mean, there's very little that I haven't, very few mediums that I haven't actually written in. Predominantly, I'm writing fantasy. I've written a little bit of sci-fi. Sci-fi is not my natural gig. I like watching it and reading it, but I don't do a lot of writing in the sci-fi. Definitely my zone is fantasy. And then I've been teaching writing for probably the last 15 years at fan conventions across the world, writers conferences, book festivals, colleges, high schools, you name it.
I see you're wearing your Fiend Folly t-shirt. Would you like to tell us a little bit about that project?
So Fiend Folly is a animated cartoon that I'm working on. This is actually my art. I actually drew everything you see on here. You can find it at fiendfolly.com. So Fiend Folly isn't created. It's still something I'm just working on. It is a project that has to be sold for it to be produced. I mean, it's a massive adult animated television show. So it needs millions of dollars to actually come into existence. I've done some things. I did a 13-minute kind of proof and concept video that's not available anywhere. It's just an internal thing. But it's a lot of fun. Basically, the kind of how I pitch it is I'll say it's kind of a cross between South Park and Game of Thrones. But the elevator pitch is in a world where all heroes are killed in an epic battle versus evil, a group of monsters accidentally save the world. So that's the gist of it. What I really like to say is it's a dick and fart kind of comedy show that's written by a very serious epic fantasy author. I mean, most of my projects are massive, long multi-novel kind of projects. The two projects that I'm currently working on by myself, I'm working on a 5-novel, 1.6 million word fantasy saga. And then with me and 3 other writers, we're actually writing a 20-novel, 4.7 million word fantasy saga. So I tend to write very large, very complex, very serious stuff, but I always like to say I started my career writing comedy. I just never made any money at it. And then I started making money writing blood and gore and tragedy and all of that. So for the last 15 years, I've really focused on that. And with Fiend Folly, I'm trying to get back into the comedy aspect that I really kind of started my career with.
So if we talk about those two genres, because it sounds like you're involved in 2 very different projects here. Does that change your approach to world building? What is your general approach? What is the first things that you do in world building? And does it change depending on whether you're building for humor or for a serious epic scope?
So first I want to define kind of my definition of world building as it relates to 2 different things. Because I'm also, a role player. I started playing Dungeons and Dragons when I was 7, back in the very early days of it. With Sony, that was as close as you can get to a role-playing game. EverQuest Next is a massive online role-playing game. So creating the backstory for that is kind of the same thing as creating a campaign world.
Can I ask just before you go on from there, EverQuest, wasn't there a role-playing game called that as well?
So EverQuest was the first online role-playing game.
Okay.
And it's the oldest online role-playing game.
Okay.
And then they came out with EverQuest 2 about 15 years ago. EverQuest 3, which was what I was hired as the lead fiction writer for, was going to be the 3rd installment of the game. Unfortunately, about 3 years, it was about a 5 to 6 year production schedule.
Yeah.
And about 3 years into production, Sony sold all of its PC division. So all of its games that were, online and PC, everything from H1Z1 to whatever. They have some sci-fi games and stuff like that. I can't remember exactly what they are. And then the EverQuest franchise, it all got sold to a company called Daybreak. And Daybreak wasn't interested in paying the hundreds of millions of dollars that it was going to take to finish the game. So they just chose to have us not continue working on it. So unfortunately, it was 3 years of my life gone down the drain. But you know, it was a great experience, and
Yeah.
you know, I wrote a ton of stuff that unfortunately no one will ever read. But you know, it was still great working on such a large project with, you know, in the gaming industry. I'm actually working on another game right now for a German company, although everything's kind of on hold because of the whole COVID thing.
Yeah.
So, you know, we'll see if what happens as far as the gaming side of things. It's not my passion. Like I do write for Shadowrun as well, although I've got a contract with them right now to write a story, but I haven't written it. I mean, it's been years. They gave me a contract with no deadline because they really wanted me to write another story for them. I've got a lot on my plate, and you know, I love those industries, and I was a big Shadowrun player as well. So I love that world, and Catalyst is a great company to work for. I've got so much on my plate doing little side projects like that. Sometimes becomes problematic just from a scheduling standpoint for me.
Yeah. Okay, so back to world building.
So I kind of wanted to define the difference between that and what I feel like we're going to be talking about today. So when you're designing, you know, world building for a campaign world, for a role-playing game, or, you know, like I did with the guys at EverQuest Next, that's much more open-ended. It's much more, you never really know where the players are going to go. You never know what's going to happen. So you tend to create almost unlimited. You just keep creating and creating and creating and creating because you're kind of creating for the unknown. You don't know where the story's going to go. And that's very, very different. And I stress this really hard as I'm teaching to writers, because a lot of, especially in the fantasy game, a lot of fantasy writers grew up playing Dungeons and Dragons. I mean, it's their passion is fantasy. So they got into writing through that kind of vehicle. And unfortunately, they get stuck in the fact that they still world build that way. And that is really bad when it comes to storytelling, because the reality is in storytelling, world building is much more confined. It's much more specific to what you're doing. You know, yes, your characters are all jerks and they all take the story, you know, in any direction that they're going to take it, but they're still your characters as opposed to your players' characters. And so you do have, you know, as the story creator, you have a lot more control, and you also want it to be, you know, the reality is when you're writing a role-playing game or a campaign world for role-playing game, you have unlimited thematic elements that you can play with, because of the fact that, you know, depending on what story you're telling, depending on which direction you want to go, is what you're going to do with that. With a story, you have to have a very defined thematic element, you know, pretty much one major theme that you're dealing with through that story. And because of that, that really does focus what you need the story to accomplish, and by default, what you need the world building to accomplish. So I don't take a lot of differences between, like, you know, the two things that I'll talk about a lot today is Realm of the Dying Sun, which is the 20 novel series. If everything goes on track, the first novel of that will drop next year, and then we will drop a brand new novel every 3 months for 5 years. So there'll be 4 novels. I mean, that's why I put together the team. And the funny thing is so of the team, all 3 of them are proteges of mine. They've all been, you know, they all started with my training. They've all come up through kind of the Drake U mindset. They became really good friends of mine, so I took them on as personal proteges. 2 of them actually worked under me at Sony. Third one would have, but he came into my life, you know, after the Sony stuff. The Sony stuff ended back in 2015, and he's my latest protege. So, you know, that's one of the beautiful things about this project is all 4 of us have the same mindset when it comes to writing, the same training, the same, you know, we all are really good friends. And so it's been a wonderful experience. We've been working on it for about 9 months now. We're 2 novels in. We'll have 5 novels completely written before we even drop that first novel. So we'll always be kind of 5 novels ahead, which is how we can maintain that pace of a new novel every 3 months.
Yeah.
But it's even that, which is as big as that project is, every story still has a very tight thematic element. And so, when you're writing a movie script, when you're writing a novel, short story, whatever, you really do focus in on those thematic elements. And so when you're world building, you concentrate on things that are going to impact that. So, I mean, if I'm writing a story with the thematic element of tyranny, maybe, I might not need to worry about what are the rituals of this society for dating and marriage and family and all. I might, but only if they tie into the tyrannical kind of thematic elements that I'm dealing with and I'm trying to push through the story. So I think that's the biggest difference between, looking at story creation, where you have this very encapsulated, very defined structure that you're kind of working through to deliver that message to the audience. Whereas in like a campaign world or whatever, you're not tied to thematic elements. You're more tied, a lot of times you're just tied to the adventure. And unfortunately, that's where a lot of, especially in the self-publishing world, you get a lot of 1-star, 2-star reviews on these books. And the funny thing is when you read the book, you're like, well, I mean, there was nothing wrong with the book. The characters seemed interesting. The world was cool. The adventure that they went on was fine. I just didn't like it. And the reason is because it comes down to understanding the target audience. When you're targeting a role-playing world, the audience is there to participate in this grand adventure because they're running a character that they're experiencing life in this. In a story, you, the story creator, are delivering this thematic message to the audience. And so, like I always say, the big goal for an author or a story creator is to put the audience through a series of events that hopefully makes them become a better human being because of the journey. And so it is this very defined, very structured, very controlled kind of thing, because you have to hit that for an audience member to be impacted by the story and to walk out of it feeling like they've experienced something. That's the thematic element. That's the whole thing that you're delivering. It is the journey. It's kind of the reason why I pick on Michael Bay all the time. Like, everyone loves Michael Bay movies. I've watched all of them, but no one watches those movies twice. And no one really remembers anything about them because Michael Bay doesn't, he's, first of all, he's in a visual medium, so you can get away with this where you can't in like a prose novel situation. But really, Michael Bay movies are about blowing stuff up. And that's really cool to watch. And you have fun for an hour and a half, 2 hours or whatever, as big robots are beating up other big robots or, whatever. But you're not moved by the journey. You don't walk out of there going, wow, I'm a better human being, as related to maybe like Shawshank Redemption or, some great piece of fiction that's going to move you at the end of that journey. And you actually have experienced this life lesson and that's the thing. That's why I feel like that's why we love fiction so much, is because we want to experience stuff like tragedy or loss or whatever, but we don't want to do it in our real lives. We want to do it in a nice, safe environment of reading a book or watching a movie so that we don't have to, have our lives on the line while we're doing all this stuff. And I think a lot of people that move from role playing, like dungeon mastering or whatever, into trying to be like, oh, I'm gonna write a book. They miss that. They miss the fact that you have to understand what it means to be a storyteller. It's not, I mean, I say this all the time. Stories are not characters. They're not worlds. They're not dragons. They're not blowing up Death Stars. They're not, none of that. None of that is a story. The story is the human message, the theme that impacts the reader audience on a human level, on a thematic level, and grows them as a human being. That's what a story is. And if you don't have, I say this all the time when I'm teaching, I always say, if you don't have a theme, you don't have a story. And every time I see people going, what is my theme? And I always say, if you're sitting there thinking, what is your theme? It's because you don't have a story. Like, you just don't. And that's a hard, harsh reality, but it's the difference between a 1-star review and, everything that I've published over the last 10 years is running 4.8, 4.9 out of 5 stars. Like, when you understand the journey of a storyteller and the job of a storyteller and the mission, you're able to deliver that. Whereas when you're just writing, oh, look at my cool swords and dragons and I'm blowing up Death Stars, and you're just Michael Baying it. Yes, I verbed his name. You're Michael Baying it. And so I wanted to start there with us because, again, that's two very different ways of approaching world building, ways of thinking about world building. And so since we're going to focus mostly on the story side, I'm assuming from the questions that you sent me, that's where you really look at story world building as a vehicle. Like, what do I need? I use this term all the time in my classes. When you're world building, go deep, not wide. And what I mean by that is you don't have to create everything. What you want to do is you want to understand what 1 or 2 or 3 or 5 things in your society, in your world, directly impact the thematic elements and the story that you're telling. And you go deep on those. You really figure out everything. So case in point, in my Genesis Oblivion saga, which is the award thingies back there, a lot of people have commented on how much I fleshed out holidays. And they're like, oh my goodness, you have all these holidays that come up and, in these people's lives. But the reality is I don't know anything about any of them. I didn't create any details other than the name. And kind of when it took place. So it'll be like, one of the characters like, ooh, I'm so excited for Salentine coming up next month. I don't know what Salentine is. I have because the festival itself never showed up in the story. And so I didn't even worry about figuring out what are the traditions, why it exists, whatever. I call them flair. You wear that flair, like the servers or whatever. And that's really what they're there for. It's there to make people go, oh, wow, I live in a world that has holidays. This world has holidays. It must be a lot like mine.
Yeah.
But I since they don't impact any aspect of the story at all, other than like, because then they get swept away in this little thing that's beyond their control. And there is a moment where they're like, oh man, I just realized yesterday was Salentine. We missed it. God, I love going to that thing. And then it makes the audience go, oh, wow, yeah, I'd hate to miss like Christmas or whatever. Like, and so I have no idea what Salentine is in that world because I only needed it for the flair of the fact that there is a holiday that they enjoy, whatever it is. And then, I'm able to use that to emotionally impact the audience. But if I was, if I ever had a time where they were going to be at the festival, I would have gone deeper to kind of flesh it out and stuff like that. So, that's the big difference. When you're looking at storytelling, you're looking at what aspects are going to directly impact the story. So I had to answer that to get into your actual question, which is, how do you see, I've got this dick and fart joke fantasy world, and I've got this dark, tragic, brutal, realistic fantasy world that I'm both writing at the same time. So how do I wrap my mind around that? And the reality is when we discussed doing this as the topic, I spent a lot of time thinking about it over the last couple of weeks. And the honest answer is there is no difference. There really isn't. There's a difference in, how it plays out. Like I was thinking about this. Mm-hmm. Just talking about magic, because magic is a part of, magic systems and creation of magic is a part of your world building. So in the realm, magic, so it's a kind of the easiest way to talk about it is, I'm just going to use some harsh terms and hopefully they won't get you banned off of YouTube. You can bleep them out, I guess, if you need to. But so this world has a bunch of races, and it is a traditional Dungeons and Dragons style, which is not something that I usually write.
Yeah.
But the crazy thing is we are writing these 20 novels to hopefully I will use them. I have a role-playing game that I've created, and I want to use this as the campaign world for that. So before the role-playing game even releases, we'll have 20 novels that you can really learn the world. And if everything works out right, the actual campaign world will take place about 50 years after the final novel. So because the final novel ends in this huge world destroying, world recreation, kind of realigning of everything. And so that's a great base for the players. You know, if I do end up creating the campaign world, they can walk into 50 years later and they know exactly, they can read these books and know exactly what happened to get them to the world that they're at in the campaign world. But and it's kind of the whole idea spawned from the fact that me and one of the other writers, who was my first guy that I brought on to Sony, had been kicking around this idea of, man, we did all this great stuff for Sony, and we really learned a lot of writing a backstory for this massive world. And he kept poking me. He's like, well, you've got this game that you keep wanting to make. Why don't we start working on, do exactly what we did for Sony, but for you in this campaign world? And so that's kind of where the idea for the Realm of the Dying Sun came from. But, you know, when we're looking at the magic, so the way we want to do the world is there's this huge elven empire that is as, you know, Nazi as it can possibly be. It dominates everything. All of the races are subjugated to this elven race. And so when we were looking, okay, how does that happen? How do we have one race that's so superior and so far beyond? And we have kind of modeled this elven empire loosely off of like Roman culture. And so there's a lot of Romanesque features, like they have a legion, they've gone up and, you know, they've enslaved populations, you know, through warfare and conquest and everything like that. And that's where they get a lot of their money, and their economy comes from all of this. But we're also in a magic world. You know, we're not in the limitations of our world. And so it's like, okay, so how do we make this happen? And one of the things that we incorporated and stumbled upon was, what if they have a magic that no one else has? What if they have a magic that is basically, you know, they're the only ones that have fireball and lightning bolts and all this other stuff, and no one else has that? Like, that would be a really easy way of how they have become this dominant empire. I mean, everybody else is using sticks and stones, and they're using tanks and machine guns. So you're really not going to be able to go up against them. And so then we, you know, as we're world building, we're like, okay, well, how did that happen? Why is it that only they have? And it's like, oh, well, what about this? And well, where does that come from? And so we ended up spending months and months of, you know, discussions, and you know, that's one of the things I do love about the project. Not only do we have the email discussions going back and forth, because we're spread out all over the world. Two of us are here in Vegas, one is in Kansas City, and one is in Germany. So we're not even in the same country. But so not only we have the emails going back and forth, but we have every Sunday we have a 2 or 3 hour meeting where we just talk world building, stories, you know, everything like that. And so our communication level is very, very high for the creation of this. But that's where it goes. So since we're writing stories, now when we're looking at world building, we're looking at that. We're looking at, you know, how do we build this world to accomplish? Because those are the thematic elements we're playing with. We're playing with tyranny. We're playing with oppression. We're playing with slavery. We're playing with, you know, all these dark topics that we want to explore, so that, again, at the end of this journey, the readers will hopefully see the horrors of tyranny, the horrors of slavery, the horrors of oppression, and kind of grow without having to live under a tyrannical, oppressive slavery society, you know. And that's what we do as storytellers. We allow them that safety to come into our world, experience this dark or dangerous world, and hopefully learn and grow as people as they go through this journey. And so that then allows us to be a lot more focused and a lot more, this is what we're doing because of the storytelling. We're creating worlds. And then it's the same thing, you know, switching gears over to Fiend Folly. So it's a social commentary that I'm playing with. It's a politically incorrect comedy. Like I said, it's a lot like South Park, a lot like Family Guy, a lot like Archer, a lot like Rick and Morty. It's in that vein. It's just a fantasy version of that. So now I'm in a different headset of, okay, now I've got this funny world. What are some things? So one of the things that I wanted is I want to be able to hardcore talk about our world and our stuff. And so, one of the decisions early on that I made was basically everything in pop culture somehow, and I'm not going to really explain it, but somehow it exists in theme filing. So like they have the Avengers, they have Game of Thrones, they have whatever. And I don't really explain how they have it because that'll break the illusion of fantasy. Although there's some ways, like there's an episode that I'm working on right now that kind of centers around a cell phone. It centers around a Samsung S9, although it's called a Sung Sam S9 Galaxy. And in the show, it's actually a magical tablet. So it's this magical artifact that is mass produced and everybody has it. But there's a lot of jokes that parallel like the G5 stuff. Like at one point, one guy's like, I'll never do that. I mean, that thing's got to rot out your brain. I mean, and he points up and he's like, I mean, look at that cell tower. And the camera moves up and it is a cell tower, just like a regular cell tower, but it has an eye of Sauron on it looking around. And he's like, there's no way you can tell me that evil isn't just streaming out of that and straight into your brain. So it's still fantasy, but it also parallels our world. And so I spent a lot of time on the magic system with that. And it when it finally fell into place, it's stupid and funny and perfect in every way. It comes down to magic comes from the 4 base elements: fame, sex, drugs, and rock and roll. So there are fame mages, sex mages, drug mages, and rock and roll mages. And they get their power from that. So that's where they get their power from. But from a world building standpoint, now I have this magic system that literally opens up all of these avenues for the thematic elements of the story, which is this social commentary. Everything about it is all about today's modern social commentary wrapped up in a dick and fart joke fantasy world. So it's, when you come up with things like that, they're just, that's what really excites me as a story creator, because now you're creating these elements in world building that absolutely facilitate everything you need. Because literally once the magic system fell into play, the stories just exploded and everything came from that. All of season 1 is wrapped around this one character who is a fame mage, which means, he has Twitter. And so we have Twitter accounts for all these characters already, kind of in the wings waiting for this stuff. Because, a part of that is that's what it is. A lot of people are kind of fame. I don't want to use the word, but prostitutes. There you go. That's the word I'll use. They're fame prostitutes. And they're doing anything and everything to get that next like, that next follower. And so that's where a lot of, by having this magic system in the world, it allows me to play with that. It allows me to have Twitter in this fantasy world. And so like the evil fame mage actually says that. He's like, follow me, on Twitter and he gives his handle, because we're going to do social media tie-in, and he'll actually have a Twitter account, and he'll actually, fans will be able to literally tweet with him from this cartoon world. And so it just, when you, again, and that's a different medium. So we're looking at TV now as opposed to novels. But it's still, storytelling is still storytelling. So when you get into that and you're thinking about world building, and you're thinking about world building for a story, and that's why you go, like I said, you go deep on those things. So we really spent a lot of time figuring out like, what can magic do and how do they use it? And because all of it affects, one of the characters, this little imp guy here is the mage of the party, and he's a sex mage, which means he gets his power from sex. But nobody's having sex with this little demon. So you can kind of extrapolate where he gets his sex magic from. It's all by himself. So, which is just fun. I mean, you know, again, it's an adult, you know,
Yeah,
it's an adult cartoon.
Yeah.
So it's got the sex jokes and all of that. If that isn't your thing, if you're not into South Park, whatever, there's other programs for you. You don't have to hate on my program just because it's not your thing.
Yeah.
But there are a lot of people who do enjoy the more adult kind of humor, which I'm one of.
So I always say, with regards to sex in fantasy, if it contributes to the plot and it contributes to character development, I am 100% fine with sex in fantasy. One of my favorite authors of all time is Jacqueline Carey, who wrote not only sex, but kink sex for 9 books. But every scene was a character development scene or a plot-driven scene. Now, I juxtapose that with Laurel K. Hamilton, who has hurt me as an author, because her sex scenes add nothing to the books.
Right, except for the sex.
Yeah, except for the sex. It's porn books. If you extract her scenes from her books, you're left with about 5 pages of plot in the later books. Not in the early books, which is what sucked me in. And then in the later books, it was just, I can't even.
Well, and again, that's, so I do write romance. I write under a female name. Do not ask what it is. The funny thing is I don't write sex in any of my fantasy, except for a couple stories. And they were all Sony stories, because Sony, like, we had this meeting, they're like, hey, we want some sex in some of these stories. And I'm like, I don't do that in fantasy. I don't. And they're like, you're gonna do it. And you know, they're paying the bills, so it's like, I guess I'm gonna do it. I cheated. There's two scenes in the Sony stuff, and again, most of the stuff wasn't released. But the 2 sex scenes, like I said, I cheated. One, the scene starts with the guy kind of finishing on top of the girl, and he collapses and they're all sweaty, and that's it. That's where it starts. And so it's a lot of them just talking while they're laying there naked. And then there's another one in a different story where they start and they kind of press up against the wall, and then I fade to black. So I still didn't even get it.
You know,
well, and I've done that before. I mean, even like in the
I think fading to black is a great way of doing it. Like, unless the money shot, as they call it in the porn industry, is actually going to add to the story, why include it?
Yeah, exactly.
Well, you're just including it for porn, you know.
Yeah. Well, but that's where I was going to. There is, so in romance, I don't even write that. I write what's called sweet romance. Okay. So in sweet romance, you're writing this love story that literally the story is going to end when they have that first kiss. You get the kiss, story's over. Like, that is the end of the story, because that's what it's always about in sweet romance. It's about, so I don't even write graphic sex in my romance, because that's just not what it's not what I'm interested in doing. Yeah. But here's the reality. When you're a storyteller, I call them circles. Yeah. You have to understand what your circle is, and your circle is the genre you're writing in. Yeah. So if we look at the 2 projects we're talking about here, I'm writing epic fantasy, and I'm writing adult politically incorrect cartoon. Yes. And there's some overlap. I mean, obviously I am a huge cartoon fan and a huge epic fantasy fan. Yeah. So I overlap, and there is some, but there isn't 100%. No. You know, there are going to be people that love Family Guy or whatever that, you know, may not even read, much less read epic fantasy. Yeah. And then the same vice versa, where, you know, I've got a lot of friends that will read epic fantasy, and, well, Brandon Sanderson is one. He's like, yeah, I have no interest in that stupid, you know, cartoon. Although Pat Rothfuss is a huge fan of the adult kind of comedy, as well as he's a, you know, epic fantasy writer. So, you know, that's what it is. And so what you have to understand as a storyteller is you're writing to a circle. And what you need to do is you need to make sure you're dead in the center of that circle. You are, like, I'm the ultimate epic fantasy fan. And so therefore I'm right in the middle. And so most people who are epic fantasy, I mean, you get fringes, you know, that's the thing. It is kind of a scale. So as fans get further and further away, eventually they no longer like what I do. And it's the same thing on the comedy side. I have my target market, and then there are other people that like, that may like Family Guy or whatever, that this one little too sex wrong, little too sex comedy or whatever, that they're like, yeah, I'm not like, I don't like that. But again, I'm writing for this for like a Netflix or a Hulu, where I don't have that limitation of language. And Family Guy is on Fox. So, very different kind of structure and limitations and everything like that. But where I was going to is, there are people that just want to read porn.
There are.
And if they're a fantasy fan and a porn fan, there is a market for everybody. The thing is that circles differ in size. So like, if you want to write dino erotica, erotica about dinosaurs, then your circle is probably, I'm assuming, pretty small.
You say that, okay, but there is a huge and thriving genre called dragon shifter porn.
I believe it. Yeah. But I don't think it's, when you say huge, I don't think it's like the size of romance or fantasy or Western or whatever.
Yeah.
So it's huge for what it is, maybe. But I would still say it's a pretty niche market, in the grand scheme of things.
Yeah.
But that's the thing. The reality is you've got to, like, everyone loves to pick on Twilight. And I'm no exception. It is, to me as a reader, it's absolutely antithesis to what I want to read as a reader. I didn't appreciate the writing style. I didn't appreciate the characters. I didn't appreciate the world. I didn't appreciate the plot holes. I didn't appreciate the story in any way, shape, or form. But it absolutely deserves to be a success. 100% it deserves to be a success, because the target market, the circle that I'm not in, the circle is millions big, and it captured them.
Yeah.
And so, because that circle loves that thing, and everything that it delivered made that circle happy. So it's the same thing with erotica. Erotica, when you're reading, if you're a type of person that's reading erotica, then you're looking for a very specific thing, and it's that gushy feeling inside. And you're not looking for character, and you're not looking for story, and you're not looking for plot, and you're not looking for any of that, as long as it hits that thing that you're looking for. It's sort of the same thing going away from that to the other extreme. And I've never understood the human mentality for this, but I do, obviously not during COVID, but I normally do 15, 20, 25 conventions a year. And so, not only am I speaking, but I've got my booth and all my paraphernalia and everything like that. A lot of people like to call it the Drake Laser Light Show, because I have this massive booth with all my awards, and, like, that's maybe, I don't know, 60% of what I have on the market, somewhere in there. So, like, I've got a pretty robust career at this point. And inevitably, someone will come up to my booth and they'll go, "Oh, I read that book." And I go, "Oh, how'd you like it?" And they didn't like it at all. And so on one side of me, I'm like, why did you come out of you? Like, what are you hoping to accomplish? Like, I'm going to go, "Oh, I quit as a writer now. I'm never going to do this again because of you and your opinion." I don't understand. But I'm also the type of person that's very inquisitive. So I don't just go, "Well, screw you, who are you?" I started, because early in my career, when this happened, I'm like, why wouldn't you like me if you like fantasy? Because early in my career, I didn't realize how divided fantasy was in subgenres. I mean, you have the big ones. You have urban fantasy like Harry Potter or whatever, and that's obviously very different than Brandon Sanderson's Wheel of Time, or how he finished the Wheel of Time from Robert Jordan, or his Stormlight Chronicles, whatever. But I started realizing that there are two distinct genres in fantasy that most people don't realize, and that is adventure fantasy versus epic fantasy.
Yes.
And while most epic fantasy fans are also adventure fantasy fans, what I learned is that a lot of adventure fantasy fans cannot read epic fantasy. And they are very different. And
Yes.
so I started asking, like when anybody would come up, I would say, so how do you feel about Brandon Sanderson or Robert Jordan
Mm.
or George Martin? And they'd go, oh, those are terrible writers. I hate all of them. And I'd go, okay, how do you feel about Terry Brooks or Terry Goodkind or David Eddings? And they're like, oh, they're great. They're my favorite authors in the whole world. And I'm like, okay, so you're an adventure fantasy fan. Stop reading epic fantasy.
Yeah.
Like, I don't like country music. Country music makes my eyes bleed. I don't listen to it. It's that simple.
Mm.
I know I don't like it and I don't listen to it.
Yeah.
So you're not an epic fantasy fan. Stop reading epic fantasy because it's not your thing.
Yeah.
And so I have been trying to educate the public on the fact that there's a huge difference between epic fantasy, which is much bigger and much more robust with way more world building and way more plot arcs and way more subplots, and adventure fantasy where we're going to go on an adventure and we're going to do this thing and then it's going to be over. It's a much different story.
Yeah.
And I think it's why so many epic fantasy fans like adventure fantasy, because it's almost like a vacation. Like you've been in this this 20 novel or 12 novel, whatever, heavy, massive thing with 30 different characters that you're trying to follow. And then you can just jump over to adventure fantasy like a Goodkind or a Brooks or whatever, and just go on this cool little fantasy adventure. And it's much smaller and more encapsulated.
If you've enjoyed my conversation with Drake, you'll enjoy his creative writing course. He is a world-renowned teacher, and for listeners of this program, he is offering 50% off his 40-lesson package. The course covers everything you need to know to build a wonderful foundation to a successful writing career. To take advantage of this offer, go to http://drakeu.com/HALFOFF. That is drakeu.com half off, and enter the code BRUTAL50 at checkout. That is capital letter B RUTAL50. The second half of our conversation will come out next week, so make sure that you're subscribed for that.